This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa, and it's Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least, that's normally what I do in this series. From time to time, I like to take a break from the more objective topics where I use empirical data to rank cards and instead do a video that is based entirely on my own opinion, and that's what we're doing today with a look at my picks for the 10 best deck names in all of Magic's history. I restricted myself to decks that have found success at Magic's highest level of competition because if I were just looking at all of the deck names on the whole internet, that would have been kind of crazy. Instead, the names I'm talking about here are relatively well-known ones that refer to deck archetypes in certain formats. So what makes for a good deck name? Well, to me, the name has to be clever or funny and ideally also descriptive. It isn't true for every deck that made this list, but the names that are clever or funny and also really inform you about the deck's strategy are the best names. Meanwhile, names that are only descriptive generally aren't clever enough to make the list. I know immediately what your Abzan control deck is, but that doesn't mean it's a good deck name. It needs something else going on to be a good deck name from my perspective. Before we get into the list, I want to take some time to tell you about this video's special sponsor, Into the AM. They've been nice enough to sponsor a couple of my videos a month lately, and they have great products. They're an apparel company that sells all kinds of awesome stuff, including graphic tees, like this shirt I'm wearing right now. This one is called Vapor Space, and like most of their tees, it's brightly colored with a really cool looking design. In addition to having awesome designs like this one, their shirts are also a really great fit, and that's pretty important to me because I'm 6'3" and 260 pounds, and that usually means I need to buy big and tall clothing. But this XXL shirt feels great, and they have sizes all over the place, from small to quadruple XL, so you're likely to be able to find something that fits you as well as this shirt fits me. Right now, Into the AM is doing a promotion where you can get 3 graphic tees for $60, and in addition to that, if you use my special link, which you should see on screen and you'll also be able to find in the description, you'll get an additional 10% off. If you're looking for cool graphic tees or other great apparel, you should definitely check them out. Alright, let's get to talking about my picks for the best Magic the Gathering deck names ever. At number 10, I have George W. Bosch. This deck was pretty much a one-off, but it was the official name of a deck that top-8'd Pro Tour New Orleans in 2003, and it's way too goofy of a name not to be included on this list. The deck was all about doing absurd things with artifacts like cheating them into play with Goblin Welder or Tinker, and one of the deck's big scary artifacts was Bosch Iron Golem, who could then hurl your expensive artifacts, including himself, at your opponent to win you the game. Back in 2003, George W. Bush was the president, so it was an especially topical name, even if it is sort of nonsensical when you really think about it. That's what keeps it at only number 10 on this list, but yeah, this being the official name of a deck written down in the history of competitive Magic is too funny for it not to be included here. At number 9, I have Miracle-Gro. This is a deck that I've personally played before, and that definitely gives it some bonus points. Miracle-Gro was an extended aggro control deck in the early to mid-2000s. The name comes from a widely sold brand of fertilizer and potting soil, and in this deck it refers to Quirion Dryad, as the deck's major plan was just to stick the Dryad early, and then just counter and interfere with everything else your opponent does throughout the game, until the Dryad's so big it just wins you the game. This would lead to the Dryad growing, so this card is central to the deck and it grows, and the Dryad is basically a plant person, so Miracle-Gro makes perfect sense. And the name extends a bit to other creatures in the deck too, namely Mystic Enforcer and Werebear, who both have Threshold, and they're 2 other creatures that would eventually get bigger as the game went on. At number 8, I have Landstill. This one is a fun play on words, but also does a great job of describing what the deck does. Landstill is a legacy and vintage deck that wants to play Standstill early. If your opponent ever wants to play a spell again, they have to let you draw 3 cards, which is a pretty hard thing for them to ever overcome. The effect of Standstill is symmetrical, but Landstill decks have a way to make it pretty one-sided, and it's all in the name of the deck. The deck has lands with activated abilities, and most importantly, creature lands. This means you can pressure your opponent with the lands you have in play while they struggle with what to do about standstills sitting around, and they generally have to eventually just give you those cards lest they get beaten to death by a land. At number 7, I have both Ka-Go and Ka-Blade, as the two names are related. Ka-Go was the name Brian Kibler used to refer to his blue-white control deck that performed well at Worlds in 2010. The Ka part came from the fact that the deck only ran 4 creatures, and all of them were Squadron Hawk, with Ka being the kind of call a Hawk makes. The Hawk is just a 2-mana 1/1 flyer that searches up copies of itself. Obviously, that's not an impressive stat line, but a 2-mana 1/1 flyer that draws you 3 cards is sort of absurd, even if all 3 of those cards are just little flyers. The name is a play on Draw-Go, a term that even in 2010 was long used to refer to control decks since their turn was generally drawing a card and saying go, since they plan on doing everything on their opponent's turn. This deck eventually transformed into Ka-Blade with the printing of Stoneforge Mystic and powerful equipment in Scars of Mirrodin block, so once again the Hawk is where the Ka part of the name comes from. The Blade part of the deck comes from the deck's equipment theme, which was largely powered by the Mystic, which could search up any of your equipment. Among the things the deck could search up were swords, like Feast and Famine and War and Peace, and you could give these blades to your Hawk. The name sort of references how silly the flavor of equipment is sometimes too, as a normal-sized Hawk carrying around a massive sword makes very little sense. At number 6, I have Mud. This is an artifact-based deck that has been around for a long time, seeing the most success in Legacy and Vintage. The name is a clever one because it has 2 separate meanings. First, Mud stands for Metalworker Ultimate Domination. Metalworker is the name of a super powerful card in the deck that can give you a ton of mana if you have artifacts in your hand, and because your deck is filled with artifacts, you will. And that mana is enough to power out powerful artifact creatures and or prison artifacts that lock your opponent out of the game very quickly. But in addition to being an anagram, the name also references the old school artifact frame, which was brown, or in other words, mud-colored. At number 5, I have Bomberman. This is the name of a deck in Vintage that is built around Auriok Salvagers. The deck uses the Salvager plus Black Lotus to produce as much mana as it wants, and it uses that mana to constantly recur either Pyrite or Ether Spellbomb. Both can work as win conditions. The Pyrite Spellbomb by just doing lethal to the opponent, and Ether Spellbomb by bouncing the opposing board every single turn and attacking with the Salvagers and any other creatures you might have hanging around. This name comes from a video game series where the titular character strategically places bombs to kill enemies and advance through various levels. Obviously enough, Bomb is in the name of the 2 cards that you combo with your Salvagers for the win, but the name has even more going on than that. The game Bomberman is pretty complex and requires a lot of strategy, and planning out how you're going to win the game with this deck is pretty complex too, and obviously your Bomberman is your Salvagers, who knows how to use bombs expertly to win the game. At number 4, I have Urzatron. This is the name of a deck that has existed at various times in Standard, Modern, and Extended, and in fact, one episode of my deck history series went in depth on the deck and how it has changed over time, so if you want to know more about this deck than just its clever name, you should check that out. Anyway, the deck seeks to get the 3 Urza's lands into play as quickly as possible, and if all goes according to plan, it can generate 7 mana on turn 3, which is enough to really overpower most decks at that stage of the game. The Tron part of the name is a reference to the 1980s animated series Voltron, which involves several independent vehicles that could combine into one super powerful robot called Voltron. So, while you need some knowledge of pop culture, the name itself is actually quite descriptive. You have these 3 lands that on their own aren't very powerful, but once you get them all together, it's game over for your opponent, and that's generally how things went for the bad guys when Voltron was assembled in the cartoon. At number 3, I have Eminent Domain. Like Miracle Grow, this is a deck that I played myself in the mid-2000s, so it definitely has a special place for me. It was a blue-red control deck that found some success in Standard around that time, and it was largely built around denying the opponent their lands, and one of the spiciest ways that it did it was with Annex and Dreamleash, either of which allowed you to straight up steal opposing lands. So you simultaneously ramp yourself while taking away your opponent's lands, and this lets you get off your Wildfire and pretty much ensures your opponent won't have more than 4 lands while you do. This obsession with land and controlling it is where the name Eminent Domain comes from. The term Eminent Domain refers to the power of the United States government to take land from private owners for public use. It's a rather controversial practice that has been brought in front of the Supreme Court before, and you can see how that's a perfect name for a deck that straight up steals lands from the opponent. At number 2, I have Death and Taxes. This is a name that refers to various disruptive creature-based decks that have largely been successful in Modern and Legacy. This deck is an aggro deck, but all the creatures in it have some sort of disruptive effect that's especially good at hating on various strategies that are prevalent in the metagame. Some of these effects tax the opposing player by making them pay more mana to play things with cards like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. So where does the death part come in? Well, the name of this deck is a reference to a famous quote made by Benjamin Franklin in the aftermath of the establishment of the US Constitution, when he said, "Our new Constitution is now established. Everything seems to promise it will be durable, but in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes." While he wasn't exactly the first person to reference the idea that death and taxes are equally inevitable, his version of the quote is the one that became the most well-known, and the "nothing is certain except death and taxes" part is a relatively common idiom in American English. So the name Death and Taxes has this implication of, if you're playing against this deck, you're inevitably going to be taxed, and you're probably also going to die, so in a somewhat roundabout way, it's a pretty intimidating name. And at number 1, I have Copycat. I think this is the best deck name ever, mostly because it's not only a funny name, but it does an excellent job of explaining the deck's primary strategy. This is the name for decks in Standard that look to use Saheeli Rai and Felidar Guardian together for an instant win combo. You would use Saheeli to copy the Guardian would then blink Saheeli and she'd come back into play with her starting loyalty, at which point you can also -2 again, and you rinse and repeat until you have an army of cats that can swing for lethal. So yeah, the deck actually looks to copy a cat. Another name for the deck that didn't stick was Crazy Cat Lady, but I'm pretty happy about that. While the name is definitely funny, it doesn't do as good a job of summarizing what the deck actually does. So yeah, I think the name Copycat is the best deck name ever because it's the right combination of clever, funny, and descriptive. The central combo in the deck was pretty degenerate too, so much so that it got banned out of Standard pretty quickly. Alright, so those are my picks for the top 10 best deck names ever. Do you think there are any funny deck names I forgot to talk about? Let me know in the comments. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on old MTG Top 10s, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.